There is a sound you have never heard, not because it is too quiet, and not because it is beyond the range of human hearing. You have never heard it because the people who understood it most deeply made absolutely certain that you never would. They buried it in stone. They encoded it in ceremony. They wrapped it inside religion and myth so that its true function would be permanently invisible to anyone who came looking. And when the modern world finally got close enough to ask the right questions, the answers were confiscated, classified, and locked behind doors that have never been reopened. We are told that the ancient world was primitive, that our ancestors, for all their ambition, were fundamentally limited. No electricity, no steel, no machines, just muscle, rope, and the kind of desperate ingenuity that comes from not having any better options. This is the story we have been told in every classroom, in every textbook, and in every documentary narrated in a serious voice over dramatic orchestral strings. The ancient world was impressive, yes, but only because they threw enough bodies at the problem. But here is what they never show you in those classrooms. They never show you the acoustic properties of the subterranean chambers at Chavín de Huántar in Peru, where specific frequencies produce hallucinations so powerful that researchers have compared them to psychedelic experiences. They never explain why the inner chambers of Newgrange in Ireland are aligned not just with the winter solstice sun, but also amplify sound in ways that modern architects still cannot fully replicate without computer modeling. They never mention the fact that in ancient Sumerian texts, the word for priest and the word for singer are the same word. They are the exact same word. That is not a coincidence. That is a confession. Today we are going to do what the institutions refuse to do. We are going to follow the sound. We are going to trace the forbidden technology of acoustic engineering across civilizations that had no contact with one another, across oceans and millennia, and we are going to find the same fingerprints on every single one of them. The same frequencies, the same chamber geometries, the same obsessive, almost fanatical attention to how sound moves through stone. And we are going to ask the question that every serious researcher eventually arrives at and then quietly backs away from. What if sound was not just a feature of ancient sacred architecture? What if it was the entire point? Let us begin not in Egypt, not in Peru, but in a place that is so familiar we have stopped looking at it properly. Let us begin in Ireland, on the eastern bank of the River Boyne, at a structure that predates Stonehenge by 500 years and the pyramids of Giza by a full 1,000. Newgrange, built approximately 5,200 years ago. A massive circular mound of stone and earth, 60 meters across, 13 meters high, aligned with such extraordinary precision that on the winter solstice and only on the winter solstice, the rising sun sends a narrow shaft of light down the 19-meter entrance passage and illuminates the inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. Archaeologists found this solar alignment astonishing. They celebrated it. They made it the centerpiece of every Newgrange tour and every Newgrange exhibition. The light show, the sunrise, the astronomical genius of the Neolithic Irish. What they mentioned far less prominently is what happens in that same inner chamber when someone makes a sound. The corbelled stone chamber at the heart of Newgrange has been studied by acoustic researchers, including Dr. Aaron Watson and Dr. David Keating, whose fieldwork revealed something the official tourist literature glosses over almost completely. The chamber amplifies and sustains sound in a way that is not accidental. The precise geometry of the corbelling, the specific curvature of the stone walls, and the narrow passage entrance combine to create what acoustic engineers would recognize as a resonant cavity. Certain frequencies, particularly the deep bass tones produced by a male voice chanting, do not merely echo. They build, they layer on top of themselves. They fill the chamber with a presence that people who have experienced it consistently describe not as sound, but as something closer to pressure, a physical force you feel in your sternum and behind your eyes. Scientists testing human subjects inside resonant chambers with similar acoustic profiles have recorded measurable neurological effects. At frequencies around 110 Hz, the kind that naturally emerge from a chamber like the one at Newgrange, EEG readings show the brain entering altered states. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logical linear thinking, goes quiet. The limbic system, the ancient emotional core of the brain, becomes dominant. In plain language, these specific sounds do not just ring inside the stone. They reach inside the skull and change the consciousness of the person standing there. The people who built Newgrange 5,000 years ago knew this. They knew it intimately, the way you know something you have worked with your whole life, the way a craftsman knows his material. They knew it because they built it, calibrated it, and used it. The acoustic effect was not a byproduct of the architecture. The architecture was built to produce the acoustic effect. And that changes everything about what Newgrange is. It is not a tomb, it is not a calendar. It is a machine that runs on sound. Now let us travel to South America, to a mountain in Peru that rises to 4,200 meters above sea level. where the Chavín people built one of the most sophisticated religious centers in the pre-Columbian world approximately 3,000 years ago. The site is called Chavín de Huántar, and official archaeology has spent decades cataloguing its carvings, its iconography, and its architectural complexity. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is well studied. It is thoroughly described. But the acoustic research conducted there by Professor John Rick of Stanford University and acoustic archaeologist Dr. Miriam Kohler reveals something that the standard descriptions almost entirely omit. The interior gallery network at Chavín de Huántar is a labyrinthine series of stone corridors and chambers that, when sound is introduced at specific frequencies, generates effects of startling power. The stone walls are not smooth. They are deliberately contoured and angled in ways that cause sound to reflect, overlap, and interfere with itself in precisely controlled patterns. Dr. Kohler's research, published in peer-reviewed journals, documented that the Chavín architects understood something that acoustic engineers today call the precedence effect, also known as the Haas effect, which describes how the brain processes sounds arriving from different directions at slightly different times. In a modern concert hall, acoustic engineers spend enormous sums of money and years of testing to harness this effect. They use computer modeling, material science, and iterative physical prototyping. The Chavín builders achieved it in stone, in a mountain 3,000 years ago. And they did it in combination with another instrument, the piezoelectric, a conch shell trumpet found in abundance at Chavín. These instruments produce a low, resonant tone that interacts with the resonant frequency of the gallery chambers in a very specific way. When the piezoelectric is blown inside the labyrinth, the sound does not merely fill the space. It activates the space. It triggers the same neurological responses documented in the Irish research. The disorientation, the dissociation from ordinary cognition, the heightened emotional and perceptual sensitivity. Pilgrims who came to Chavín de Huántar came to have their minds altered, and the alteration was not achieved with herbs or fasting alone. The architecture itself was part of the medicine. Here is the critical point. Newgrange is in Ireland. Chavín de Huántar is in Peru. No ancient historian has ever argued for a connection between Neolithic Ireland and pre-Columbian Peru. There is no proposed trade route, no diffusionist theory, no artifact crossover. These were two completely separate civilizations developing in complete isolation from one another. And yet they both built resonant stone chambers with essentially identical acoustic profiles and essentially identical effects on human consciousness. That is not cultural exchange. That is convergent discovery. Two separate peoples in two separate corners of the world, independently discovering the same truth about sound and building the same machine to harness it. But we need to press further, because this is not only about what ancient sound technology did to the human mind. There is a second and far more controversial body of evidence suggesting that the ancients understood something about what sound can do to physical matter. The ruins of Pumapunku in Bolivia sit at an elevation of nearly 4,000 meters. They are made of andesite and red sandstone blocks. Some of these blocks weigh in excess of 100 tons. The andesite, a volcanic rock of extraordinary hardness, was quarried from a site more than 90 kilometers away. Mainstream archaeology proposes, with some discomfort, that these blocks were transporting using reed boats, earthen ramps, and human labor. When pushed on the engineering specifics, the answers become increasingly vague. The calculations have never fully worked out. The required workforce numbers, the logistical demands, the absence of any construction debris or infrastructure evidence at the site, all of it creates a picture that doesn't quite close. But here is what mainstream archaeology never discusses in relation to Pumapunku. The specific type of stone used most extensively, the andesite, shares a notable physical property with the granite of the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber. It has immeasurably high quartz content, and quartz is piezoelectric. Piezoelectricity is not a fringe concept. It is not alternative science. It is the principle behind the spark igniters in your gas cooker, the precision timekeeping in your wristwatch, and the ultrasound equipment in every hospital on Earth. When quartz crystals are subjected to mechanical stress, such as the stress produced by a powerful acoustic wave, they generate an electromagnetic field. When they are subjected to an electromagnetic field, they vibrate. The relationship is bidirectional. You can push quartz with sound and get electricity. You can push quartz with electricity and get sound. And in stone that is composed substantially of quartz, a sufficiently powerful and precisely tuned acoustic input will cause the entire mass of the stone to vibrate at its own resonant frequency. This is not metaphysics. This is materials science. The question that nobody in mainstream archaeology is funded to ask is this: what happens to the apparent gravitational mass of a large quartz-bearing stone when its entire crystalline structure is simultaneously vibrated at its resonant frequency by a sufficiently powerful external acoustic field? The theoretical physics answer is not as clean and dismissive as the institutions would like. acoustic radiation force is a real and well-documented phenomenon. At sufficient amplitudes and precise frequencies, it can counteract gravitational force. Modern ultrasonic levitators do exactly this with small objects. The scaling problem, moving from milligrams to tons, is an engineering problem, not a physics problem. The law does not prohibit it. The law merely makes it extraordinarily difficult. Unless you have 3,000 years and an entire civilization dedicated to understanding exactly how to do it. There is a figure who appears in the historical record at the intersection of sound, stone, and the deep knowledge of the ancient world, and he is almost never discussed in the context of his full significance. His name is Amphion, and he is one of the founding myths of ancient Greece. According to the Theban cycle, Amphion was given a golden lyre by the god Hermes, and played it with such mastery that the stones of Thebes assembled themselves into walls without any human labor. The stones simply moved to the music and found their places. Every classical scholar will tell you this is allegory, poetry, mythological ornamentation around the mundane historical reality of city building. But here is the question those scholars never satisfactorily answer. Why is this specific motif, the singing of stones into place, not unique to Thebes? Why does it appear in the founding myths of Jericho, where the walls fall to trumpets? Why does it appear in the Norse Eddas, where the giant Hrungnir builds walls with supernatural speed? Why does it appear in the Welsh Mabinogion, in the Maya Popol Vuh, in the oral traditions of the Aboriginal Australians who describe their ancestors literally singing the landscape into existence, the so-called songlines? Why across every major civilization on every inhabited continent does the human mythological record insist on the same impossible thing, that in the beginning, the great works of stone were made with sound? The anthropological consensus says this is because human beings naturally poeticize their history. We turn labor into legend. We turn the long, slow effort of construction into the miraculous speed of divine music because it makes a better story. This is a reasonable explanation. It is also precisely the kind of explanation that forecloses inquiry. Once you have decided that the oral traditions are poetry, you stop asking what they are describing. You stop asking what specific technical knowledge might be encoded in the metaphor. You stop asking whether the metaphor is actually a description. The ancient transmitters of this knowledge knew that if they stated it plainly, it would be suppressed or destroyed. They knew that conquerors burn libraries, that priests rewrite cosmologies, that empires reframe the past to legitimize the present. So they hid the technology the one place it could not be burned. They hid it in story, in ceremony, in the structures themselves. They built the knowledge into the geometry of the chambers and the resonant choice of stone materials, trusting that if someone ever came looking with the right instruments and the right questions, the stone would still answer. There is one figure in the modern era who came the closest to making this technology visible, and the institutional response to his work tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the establishment takes this threat. His name was Royal Raymond Rife. In the 1930s, working in San Diego, Rife developed a microscope of extraordinary power that the mainstream scientific community of his era was unable to replicate and therefore refused to acknowledge. Using this microscope and his research into vibrational frequencies, Rife proposed that every physical structure, biological or mineral, has a specific resonant frequency at which it can be disrupted or energized. He called this the mortal oscillatory rate. He demonstrated, in controlled laboratory conditions, that specific audio frequencies could shatter cellular structures, disrupt cancer tissue, and alter the molecular integrity of solid matter. His clinical trials produced results that his contemporaries found impossible to reconcile with prevailing theory. The American Medical Association moved against him. His laboratory was raided. His equipment was confiscated or destroyed. His collaborators were pressured into silence or had their professional licenses revoked. By the 1950s, Royal Raymond Rife was a discredited, broken man, and his research had been effectively erased from the official record. Today he is almost exclusively discussed in alternative health circles, which makes it very easy for the mainstream to dismiss him without engaging with the actual evidence. That is the institutional design. If you cannot refute the work, you destroy the man. Then you destroy the context that would make his work legible. But Rife's core insight, that physical matter has a resonant frequency, and that hitting that frequency with acoustic or electromagnetic energy produces profound physical effects, has not been disproven. It has been quietly absorbed. The same principle underpins lithotripsy, the medical procedure used today in every major hospital to destroy kidney stones using precisely calibrated ultrasonic pulses. No scalpel, no surgery, no chemical. Just sound aimed at the resonant frequency of the stone until the stone breaks apart. We do this to human bodies routinely and safely. We call it modern medicine. When the ancients proposed doing it to building materials, we called it superstition. We need to confront something uncomfortable about the way we think about time and knowledge. Live inside a model of history that is fundamentally linear. Primitive past, advancing present, brilliant future. We assume that because we arrived at our current technological sophistication through a specific path, that path is the only one. We assume that because we use fossil fuels and silicon chips and reinforced concrete to build our world, anyone who built great things before us must have been doing a cruder version of the same approach. Bigger rocks instead of machines. More workers instead of motors. This is not logic, this is narcissism. It is the narcissism of the present, and it actively prevents us from seeing what is directly in front of us. The ancient builders left behind a physical record that does not fit the story we tell about them. The tolerances on the stones of the Sacsayhuaman fortress in Peru are so tight that you cannot insert a piece of paper between them, not because the builders were particularly careful with their primitive hammers, but because tolerances that tight require machinery or methods that we cannot identify from the tool marks left behind. The limestone casing stones of the Great Pyramid were polished to a surface accuracy of 1/100th of an inch across blocks weighing 2.5 tons. The average machining tolerance in modern precision engineering is 10,000ths of an inch. The ancient Egyptians were within an order of magnitude of modern CNC milling on blocks the size of automobiles, using supposedly bronze tools and wooden sledges. At some point, the evidence for a lost advanced technology becomes more parsimonious than the evidence for extraordinary primitive achievement. At some point, the simplest explanation is not that they worked harder than we can imagine. The simplest explanation is that they knew something we have forgotten. What was it? What was the actual nature of the knowledge? The evidence converges on a unified theory. The ancients possessed a deep empirical understanding of resonance physics, specifically the relationship between acoustic frequency, material composition, and gravitational mass reduction. They understood that quartz-bearing stone, when subjected to a standing wave at its precise resonant frequency, exhibits altered electromagnetic properties. They understood that large enough arrays of sound-producing instruments, positioned at geometrically exact intervals around an object, could generate acoustic interference patterns of sufficient power to manipulate the effective weight of that object. And they built entire civilizations around the infrastructure required to apply this knowledge. The temples were not built to worship the technology. The temples were the technology. The ceremonies were not symbols of the building process. The ceremonies were the building process. This knowledge was almost certainly not universal. It was held by a priestly technical class, transmitted through initiation and practice, protected fiercely from the uninitiated because a technology that can move mountains can also be weaponized. When those civilizations fell, when the priests were killed and the initiates scattered, the knowledge did not die cleanly. It fragmented, it survived in pieces, a geometric ratio preserved in a temple's dimensions. A specific chant encoded in a religious ceremony, a myth about stones that sang themselves into position, pieces of a puzzle that has been lying scattered across the archaeological record for 3,000 years, waiting for someone with the right instruments and the willingness to look. We are standing at a threshold. Acoustic physics is advancing faster than at any point in history. Acoustic levitation is no longer theoretical. It is demonstrated in laboratories weekly. The understanding of how sound interacts with crystalline materials is deepening rapidly. The gap between what our laboratory instruments can achieve and what the ancient builders appear to have achieved is narrowing. The question is whether we will be allowed to close it, whether the institutions that have spent 2 centuries building a story about primitive ancients and inevitable modern progress will permit the kind of honest inquiry that would unravel that story completely, whether the funding will flow, the papers will be published, and the films will be released instead of confiscated. History is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is written by the people who controlled what the victors were allowed to remember. The sound is still there, encoded in stone, preserved in ceremony, waiting inside the resonant chambers that have survived every empire and every book burning and every institutional dismissal. All it requires is someone willing to listen, not just with their ears, but with instruments precise enough to measure what the ancients built, and a mind open enough to hear what the measurement is saying. They did not drag those stones, they sang them. And the song, if we are patient and honest and brave enough to hear it, is still playing in the walls. If this investigation into acoustic technology and lost ancient knowledge has raised more questions than it has answered, that is exactly what it should do. The next question to ask is who exactly was responsible for ensuring this knowledge stayed hidden, and what institutions today still have a vested interest in keeping it that way. That investigation begins in the next video.